Chapter 7: Che's Ideas about Imperialism and Socialism. Che silently resigned his cabinet post in Fidel Castro's government and disappeared from public view in 1965. Deutschmann, 1994, 2731. There was a great deal of speculation at the time about his disappearance. Some believed Che and Castro had had a serious disagreement, and Che had been imprisoned or secretly executed. There were also reports that Che had been killed in the Dominican Republic during the Civil War that took place there in the spring of 1965. Later on, there was speculation that Castro or elements within the Cuban regime had eliminated Che because of his opposition to certain policies advocated by the political faction within the Cuban Communist Party that believed Cuba should follow the advice of Cuba's advisors from the Soviet Union and the socialist Eastern European countries, such as Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany, closely tied to the Soviet Union. By the beginning of 1964, it was evident even to Che that his four-year plan initiated in 1961 to industrialize Cuba was having great difficulties. He realized he and many of his comrades had underestimated the difficulties involved in transforming Cuba from a largely agrarian economy, dominated by the production and exportation of sugar, into an industrialized economy based on the production of a wide range of agricultural as 120 CheGuevara, well as manufactured products, and the extensive application of modern technology. Tabo 1996, 482-500. He made Herculean efforts in his posts as head of the National Bank and Minister of Industry. He worked 16-18 hours a day and drove those around him to do the same. He had a genius for finding innovative solutions to the country's problems associated with its lack of technology and the technical skills needed for industrial development. However, his exemplary leadership and commitment to his responsibilities and ideals could not overcome the many organizational deficiencies, widespread lack of technology, shortage of replacement parts, caused largely by the U.S. economic blockade of Cuba, and the lack of trained cadres. All of these problems obstructed the expansion of both Cuba's agricultural production and the development of its underdeveloped manufacturing sector. On the basis of what Che told his friends, it is possible to ascertain what his thinking was during this period. In the FIRST place, it is clear that Che was forced to admit that Cuba would have to return to its historical mode of livelihood, that is, the production of sugar for export. Yet he was not willing to accept the advice of Cuba's Soviet and Eastern European advisors that the revolutionary government should abandon the goal of industrializing the country. He felt strongly that Cuba's economic relations with the socialist bloc of nations led by the Soviet Union should not be the same as those between capitalist countries. If Cuba could not industrialize by itself, as a result of its neocolonial legacy and the underdeveloped character of its economy, then, Che argued, the more developed socialist countries, such as the Soviet Union, had an obligation to help Cuba. He thought the Soviet Union should finance Cuba's long-term efforts to industrialize instead of expecting Cuba to serve primarily as the sugar mill for the socialist bloc. Che found little sympathy for his ideas among the Soviet Union's leaders and the Soviet advisors in Cuba. They regarded his plans to industrialize Cuba as unrealistic and impractical. Even if Cuba were to succeed in transforming its economy with Soviet assistance, they argued that there would be an insufficient market for Cuba's manufactured goods. Moreover, they pointed out the island lacked most of the raw materials needed for heavy industries. Anderson, 1997, 488-89. They argued the size of Cuba's internal market was not large enough to make the production of its own manufactured items economically justifiable, and that, in view imperialism and socialism 121 of Cuba's political isolation, it could not expect to export manufactured products to any of its neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. When Che countered that Cuba would have an export market in Latin America as soon as the revolution was carried to other countries of Central and South America, the Soviets made it quite clear that they were not willing to risk basing their economic assistance to Cuba on this eventuality. Che was also critical of the Soviet Union's state capitalist economic system and its reliance on what he regarded as basically capitalist methods of organization, management, and investment. In particular, Che felt that the Soviet system's reliance on material incentives and a system of decentralized financial management in its state industries were contradictory to the development of a genuine socialist economy and the development of a socialist consciousness on the part of the workers. Jur Esi, 1968, A 292-316. Moreover, he suspected Moscow and Washington had entered into a tacit agreement to respect each other's international spheres of influence. And as part of this agreement, Moscow had promised to restrain Havana from promoting revolution throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Che felt strongly that Cuba should align itself with the newly independent Third World nations of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and assist national liberation struggles and socialist revolutions throughout the still colonized parts of the Third World. This idea motivated him to travel extensively throughout Africa and Asia during early 1965. He went on an extended state visit to Africa, China, and then back to Africa during the 3 months of 1965. In Africa, Che visited Algeria, Mali, Congo-Brazzaville, Guinea, Ghana, Dahomey, Benin, Tanzania, and Egypt, where he met with important African and Arab leaders such as Presidents Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, and Abdel Nasser of Egypt. Anderson, 1997, 620-21. Che also made a trip to the People's Republic of China with the official purpose of explaining Cuba's position with regard to the growing international conflict between the Soviet Union and China. The Chinese were upset over what they considered to be Cuba's increasing support for the Soviet Union. Because of the growing tension between Cuba and China at the time, Che had only a brief, formal meeting 122 at CheGuevara with China's famous leader Mao Zedong, but he was able to meet at length with other top Chinese officials and discussed with them his ideas about a united anti-imperialist front to liberate the Third World from Western U.S., British, French, Belgian, and Portuguese imperialism. Actually, Che's views were closer to those held at the time by the Chinese leadership than to the Soviet Union's, since he had become increasingly critical of the Soviet Union's international relations. He considered the course adopted by the Soviet Union under Premier Nikita Khrushchev to be a rightist deviation from socialism. He also considered the emphasis placed by the Soviet advisors in Cuba on continuing the specialization in sugar production, the use of material incentives to increase labor productivity, and allowing Cuba's state enterprises to adopt financial self-management, as contrary to the Cuban Revolution regime's commitment to the rapid industrialization of the economy and the replacement of capitalist material incentives and methods of organization with communist moral incentives and methods of organization. He predicted, correctly as it turned out, the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc of socialist countries would return to capitalism if they continued to rely on capitalist market mechanisms, material incentives, and enterprise self-management. Anderson, 1997, 697. Following his visit to China, he returned to Africa via Paris, where he learned definitively of the death of his friend Mazzetti in Argentina and his abortive effort to start a guerrilla foco there. From Paris, he flew to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where he met with President Nyerere and with the representatives in Dar es Salaam of the armed guerrilla movements fighting for national independence at that time in the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, white settler-controlled Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and the former Belgian Congo, Tabo 1996, 514-15. Among the representatives whom he met in Dar es Salaam were Gaston Soumaliat and Laurent Kabila, two of the leaders of the Congolese rebel movement that was then in control of the eastern portion of the Congo. Although he was not impressed by Soumaliat and most of the other representatives he met, he was favorably impressed by Kabila's leftist views, which he found similar to his own, and acting on the authority that he had previously received from Fidel Castro, Che offered to send to Kabila's forces Cuban arms and military advisors. Imperialism and Socialism 123. From Tanzania, he went to Egypt, where he told President Nasser of his desire to go to the Congo at the head of the contingent of Cuban advisors he had promised Kabila. In February 1965, Che appeared as an observer at the second conference of the Organization of Afro-Asian Solidarity in Algeria, where he initiated a personal crusade to create an anti-imperialist front among the neutral nations of the Third World. In the speech he delivered at this conference, he criticized the socialist countries for being the accomplices of imperialist exploitation and called on them to support popular revolutions in the neo-colonial and colonial countries of the Third World, instead of pursuing their own selfish foreign policy. Jersey 1968, 378-86. The Soviet observers who were in attendance were outraged. Following the conference, both Ben Bella of Algeria and Nasser of Egypt tried to talk Che out of the idea of heading a Cuban contingent to the Congo. Nasser warned him that if he went to the Congo, he would be considered a white man, and that his involvement there could only turn out badly. Tabo 1996, 517. Ben Bella was more supportive and allowed Che to establish a base in the hills overlooking Algiers, which he and representatives of other Latin American revolutionary groups, supported by the Cuban government, used for training purposes, and maintained as a sanctuary until Ben Bella was overthrown by a military coup in June 1965. When Che returned to Cuba in March 1965, he was ready to resign his position in the Cuban government in order to devote all his efforts to furthering the armed struggle against imperialism. Since he had played such an important role in the Cuban Revolution, although not Cuban, he assumed he would be able to do the same elsewhere, not only in Latin America, but this time in Africa. Shortly after Che returned to Havana, he met with Fidel Castro to discuss the results of his travels and his views regarding the position Cuba should take in international affairs. At this meeting, it appears that Castro reproached Che for criticizing the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries in his speech at the Organization of Afro-Asian Solidarity in Algiers. Tabo 1996, 522. Castro also made it clear that he was under both external and internal pressure to move Cuba closer to the Soviet Union in the growing split between the Soviet Union and revolutionary China. In fact, the Soviets and the old guard members of the Cuban Communist Party within the Cuban regime were pressing him to come 124 CheGuevara out openly in favor of the ideological position held by the leaders of the Soviet Union, and against the more radical ideological line taken by the leaders of the People's Republic of China. These former allies were now locked in an international struggle for the leadership of the international socialist movement. Che's radical brand of revolutionary socialist internationalism was not shared by the leadership of the Soviet Union and by the leaders of most of the pro-Soviet communist parties in Latin America. The Soviet leadership regarded what they considered Che's radical leftist adventurism to be a threat to their own international strategy of peaceful competition and coexistence with the United States and its allies. However, there appears to have been some sympathy for Che among the Soviet leaders, especially since his influence had been decisive in convincing Fidel Castro to align Cuba with the Soviet Union shortly after the revolutionary government was formed in Cuba. According to Fedor Berlatsky, a former advisor to Soviet Premier Khrushchev, the Soviet leadership disliked Che's revolutionary adventurism, and they were afraid his example would lead the Cubans and other leftists in Latin America into taking actions that would provoke a major military confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. Anderson, 581. But in an interview he gave to the journalist John Lee Anderson in 1995, Berlatsky claimed, "Even though Che was against our interests, there was still some sympathy for him. There was a romantic aura around him. He reminded people of the Russian Revolution." Anderson, 581. Anderson also interviewed Nikolai Meretsov, who was responsible for maintaining relations between the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Communist parties in the non-European socialist states, such as Cuba and Vietnam. Meretsov told Anderson he fell in love with Che upon meeting him because of his very beautiful eyes, and because his stare was so generous, so honest, and because he was impressed by the way he spoke with such impetus, as if his words were squeezing you, Anderson, 585. According to Anderson, Merettsov's appraisal was that Che's views could not be easily classified. Externally, one could truly say that, yes, Che Guevara was contaminated by Maoism, because of his Maoist slogan that the rifle can cree imperialism and socialism 125-8 power. And certainly, he can be considered a Trotskyite because he went to Latin America to stimulate the revolutionary movement there. But in any case, I think these are external signs, superficial ones, and that deep down, what was most profound in him was his aspiration to help man on the basis of Marxism-Leninism. Anderson, 585. Merettsov told Anderson that he thought that Che's personal commitment to the cause of revolution was his peculiarity. He said Che's dedication to armed struggle, while a source of worry for some members of the leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, was not perceived by the Soviet leadership as a whole to be a cause of significant concern. Whether this last statement about their lack of concern was true is hard to assess now. Che was committed to both fomenting revolution on a truly international scale and personally putting into practice his thesis that it was possible for a small, if committed, guerrilla force to ignite a full-scale popular revolution in countries under the control of oppressive regimes backed by U.S. imperialism. His so-called peculiar commitment to these beliefs was shared by most of his closest friends and comrades, as well as many admirers and sympathizers around the world. His commitment threatened the positions of the pro-Soviet leaders of the Orthodox Communist parties in Cuba and elsewhere, as well as many other leftist political parties and governments not aligned with the Soviet Union. Che openly criticized these parties and movements for their unwillingness to fight GHTU's imperialism and to engage in an armed revolution to bring down the capitalist regimes in their countries and build socialist societies in their place. Che realized, however, Cuba had no other alternative but to side with the Soviet Union. Che also knew his continued presence in the government was a liability. This was because of several reasons. His disagreements with the Soviets over their ideological line and their foreign policy, Cuba's growing dependence on Soviet military aid and trade, and his desire to involve himself directly in the revolutionary struggles against imperialism taking place in Latin America and around the world. He realized that it would be impossible for him to involve himself directly in a revolutionary struggle in Latin America or Africa if he continued to hold a high position in the Cuban government. The 126 CheGuevara international repercussions would have been too great for Cuba. In view of these circumstances, Che decided to resign his positions in the Cuban government and leave Cuba. His main interest was carrying the revolution to South America, particularly his homeland Argentina. He had established ties with revolutionary groups throughout Latin America and in other parts of the world while he held his important positions in the Cuban government. And he now planned to use some of these connections to carry out his plans of taking an active leadership role in creating or aiding armed revolutionary movements in South America and Africa. His friend and confidant Fidel Castro encouraged him to go to Africa and assist the revolutionary movement in the Congo, since he felt the conditions were not yet ready for him to go to South America. Castro knew that he had become increasingly restless in his governmental posts in Cuba and was anxious to carry out what he considered to be his historic mission of liberating the Third World countries from Western imperialism and capitalist exploitation. Anderson, 1997. 628. Of course, this meant resigning from his important positions in the Cuban government, and it meant leaving behind all that Che had accomplished in Cuba, as well as his wife and 5 children and most of his Cuban comrades, except for those who would accompany him via Arresti to the Congo and later to Bolivia. It was an extremely difficult and courageous decision for him to make. However, Che was a man who was totally committed to carrying out his convictions. His wife, Aleida March, knew this well. She had learned this by his side during the Revolutionary War against the Batista dictatorship. And she always knew that one day he would leave her and their children to fulfill his chosen destiny, to fight GHT to the death, if necessary, against imperialism and for the establishment of socialism. In her book about their life together, March 2008, She discusses the tremendous sacrifice, CES, they both endured as a result of his total commitment to live by his revolutionary ideals. Ideals that she shared wholeheartedly with him. The separations were almost unbearable for both of them, since they never knew when or whether they would see each other again. Indeed, she tried repeatedly to convince him to take her with him, both on his mission to the Congo and to Bolivia. But he convinced her the time was not right for her to join him and their imperialism and socialism. 127 young children needed her to stay with them until they were much older. Che was very close to his 5 children even though they were very young when he left them. To his 5 resti child Hilda Beatriz Guevara Gadia, who lived with her mother, his 5 resti wife, Hilda Gadia, in Havana, and to his 4 children with Aleida March. Aleida, Camilo, Celia, and Ernesto, who lived with him in Havana. He was also very much in love with Aleida. Therefore, his separation from Aleida and his children was very painful, and he missed them deeply while he was in the Congo and Bolivia. The personal side of Che and his many admirable personal traits are revealed beautifully in Aleida March's book on their life together. She describes many intimate moments of touching tenderness and romantic love between them. In general, her account of their life together reveals both his continuing devotion to her and the sincere concern he always showed for her feelings and her personal welfare. During his long absences from Cuba, he would write love letters and poems for her and make tape recordings to be given to her and the children. In the letters and poems he wrote for her, he nearly always referred to her as my unica, my only one, and they all display great affection and longing for her. For example, here is a fragment of a poem he wrote for Aleida upon his departure for Bolivia, March 2008, 221. Adios, my only one, do not tremble before the hungry wolves nor in the cold steppe of absence. By my heart I carry you, and together we will continue until the road fades away. And in the last message she received from him in Bolivia, he wrote the following: My only one, I am taking advantage of the trip of a friend to send you these words, which could go by mail, but a semi-official road seems more intimate. I could tell you that I miss you to the point of losing sleep, but I know you would not believe me, so I will abstain. 128 CheGuevara. But there are days in which the homesickness becomes uncontrollable and possesses me. On Christmas and New Year's, above all, you don't know how much I miss your ritual tears, below a sky of new stars that remind me of how little of my life I have devoted to personal affairs. March 2008, 225. In this last communication with his wife, one can sense his homesickness and longing for her, as well as the sadness he felt over how little of his life he had spent with her and their children. He ended this message with a kiss for the little pieces of his children, all the rest, and a kiss for her that he said was pregnant with sighs and anguish. This romantic personal side of Che's life was little known to all but his inner circle of family and friends until Hilda Gadia published her book in the late 70s on her relationship with Che, and more recently Aleida March published her book on their life together. In this regard, it is also important to recognize that the ideological cornerstone of Che's revolutionary thinking and practice was not guerrilla warfare or armed revolution, but his almost utopian concept of El Hombre Nuevo, the new man or human being. He used this concept to express the almost spiritual belief he held in the development of new socialist human being for the 21st century. In fact, he believed the development of this new type of human being was an essential aspect of the construction of a genuine socialist society. His belief in this ideal human being was an important source of inspiration for him and for those who adopted or were influenced by his views on socialism and the future development of humanity. Siles, Del Val, 1996, 4792. Che was dedicated to living his life in accordance with his ideal concept of the new type of human being that would come into existence in the revolutionary struggle to build a new socialist world order for humanity. Che believed this new type of human being would arise out of the revolutionary struggle to liberate humanity from the egoistic individualism, dehumanizing exploitation, and social alienation associated with capitalism. Che felt the struggle against capitalism and the construction of a new socialist order required a new type of human being who would always be committed to making personal sacrifice, CES, for the good of others. Nowhere is this concept of El Hombre Nuevo presented more explicitly than in Che's Imperialism and Socialism 129 essay, Socialism and Man in Cuba. Written early in 1965 while he was traveling as a Cuban statesman in Africa. What follows are some brief excerpts from this essay, in Jersey 1968, 398-400. He describes the characteristics of revolutionary 21st century men and women who he hoped would arise out of the struggle to build a socialist society. First and foremost, he believed they would be guided by strong feelings of love for humanity. He wrote, "Let me say, at the risk of appearing ridiculous, that the true revolutionary is guided by strong feelings of love. It is impossible to think of a true revolutionary without this quality." While he felt that there could be no life outside of the revolution for the men and women of the new socialist society, he also believed the revolutionary leaders of the 21st century would have to avoid falling into dogmatic extremes and have a highly developed sense of justice and truth. Thus, he wrote, "There is no life outside the revolution. In these conditions, the revolutionary leaders must have a large dose of humanity, a large dose of a sense of justice and truth, to avoid falling into dogmatic extremes, into cold scholasticism, into isolation from the masses." As for the level of social commitment required of the new human being, he believed very strongly that this commitment would require a great deal of personal sacrifice. In this regard, he seems to have been writing as much about himself as the new socialist human being when he wrote the following lines. "Each and every one of us punctually pays his share of sacrifice, aware of being rewarded by the satisfaction of fulfilling our duty, aware of advancing with everyone toward the new human being who is to be glimpsed on the horizon." CheGuevara believed this ideal new human being would develop in the future, despite the difficulties of achieving the level of social consciousness and social commitment required for this human development to take 130 CheGuevara place. Thus, he wrote, "The road is long and in part unknown, but we are aware of our limitations, and we will make the 21st century human being, we ourselves." His widow, Aleda March, recounts in her book about their life together how Che's closest friends and comrades felt that he was the best example of the new human being he wrote and spoke about so frequently. As Fidel Castro says in his memoir of Che, Deutschmann 1994, 108-9, he was a living example. It was his style to be the example, to set the example. He was a person with a great spirit of self-sacrifice, with a truly Spartan nature, capable of any kind of self-denial. His policy was to set an example. We could say that his entire life was an example in every sphere. He was a person of absolute moral integrity, of remarkably firm principles, a complete revolutionary who looked toward the future, toward the humanity of the future, and who above all stressed human values, humanity's moral values. None of the words I use about him involve the slightest exaggeration, the slightest overestimation. They simply describe the man we knew.